There's no part of your unconscious mind that is there to cause harm.
Right.
And you say that to somebody that's been suffering from PTSD for 40 years and they'll laugh at you. But in reality, the mind of the person causing these problems, even with the schizophrenias, is trying to protect them, but has not been given the correct resources to do that with. It's taken behaviors and patterns that it's learnt in the first 5 years and has used those to try and protect its owner. But in reality, when it understands that it's no longer protecting you, it will drop the behavior instantly.
Welcome to Change Your Mind, Change Your Life. I'm Jim.
And I'm Lynn. I think our show today is of particular importance, given the steep increase in the numbers of people experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. Cases of PTSD in the U.S. have risen dramatically during recent years. 70% of adults have experienced some type of a traumatic event at least once in their lives, and that's 223.4 million people. And of those, up to 20% will develop full-blown PTSD. Gary Johnston, our featured guest, is engaged in a worldwide online research program with sufferers of high-level stress disorders, especially PTSD, in an attempt to clarify the basis of triggers and perceptions of these reactive disorders in different age, social, and religious groups. He holds a postgraduate diploma in clinical hypnosis and is a master timeline therapy practitioner.
Gary, we're truly honored and excited that you could join us today. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lynn. Good morning, Jim. How are you over there? I've always been fascinated by the uniqueness that each mind exhibits, that everybody is unique and everybody reacts to circumstances in a different way. But the interesting thing in anxiety disorders is that there are some consistencies across the spectrum that in some cases haven't been identified before. And many years ago, or maybe 25 years ago now, I had a client come in the door of the clinic that I was running. Let's call him Ken for the sake of a name. And Ken came in obviously extremely distressed. He was in tears and he was extremely anxious, very fidgety. And he sat down and he said, look, I don't want to put any pressure on you, but I've been through the mill for 20 years. I've been going to psychiatrists and psychologists and the medical guys and the military guys. He'd actually come out of Vietnam some 20-odd years earlier. And he sat down and said, look, no pressure on you, but if you don't give me some hope today, I'm going to go and kill myself.
Oh, my.
And it was a bit of a shock to be put in that position because whilst I dealt with anxiety disorders for a number of years, I hadn't actually come across this bad a case of PTSD. So we had a chat and we got him through it, and he actually went on to live a long life. But what he did do was, I guess, trigger an interest in the intensity of the psychological reactions that he was going through, but not just the psychological reactions, the physiological reactions as well. So we started doing a lot of work in those areas and found eventually that there are two spectrums that I've basically developed an understanding of. One spectrum is the anxiety spectrum, which covers a broad range of different disorders, all the way from basic phobias and panic disorders all the way through to the upper end of those disorders, which includes OCD, PTSD, and those sort of things. And the other one is a parallel anxiety spectrum, which probably a lot of people would disagree with me, but I put the schizophrenias and the entire spectrum of schizophrenias in anxiety disorder spectrum as well. Usually people with schizophrenias have a long history, especially in early life, of trauma or abuse. And it triggers the same kind of psychotic symptoms that, for instance, show up in flashbacks, the full-on flashbacks in PTSD. Now, a flashback, for the purpose of what we're talking about, is something where you could be sitting in the room right now, experiencing this conversation, and suddenly you're back in the event that triggered the PTSD in the first place. And I'm not just talking about an imagined event, but actually there. You're seeing it, you're feeling it, you're smelling it, and everything else disappears. Well, that's a psychotic type of reaction, which is very similar to what is seen in the schizophrenias as well. There's always long periods of high anxiety disorders, sometimes lifelong anxiety disorders before these things trigger. The method that the mind uses to hang on to them and to continue to evolve the problem are slightly different. I'm not saying that everyone with PTSD is schizophrenic. It's not. They're totally different in the way that they present and the background, but certainly the effect of PTSD at the upper end of the problem is really very, very similar in some ways, and just as frightening. The schizophrenias and the psychosis type problems are on a spectrum very similar to the anxiety spectrum. So you can have somebody from a fairly low level all the way to full blown, and the triggers vary quite a bit between them as well. So yes, you're right. When you get to the top end of the schizophrenias, there is a physiological basis for a lot of it, because the neurotransmitter system, the method by which the nervous system functions has been, in some cases, in fact most cases, has been modified in some way, and that's where the voices and the visual disperceptions come from. And it's not dissimilar to that flashback type experience in PTSD, where the nervous system has been disrupted in some way, but generally, relatively, well, I won't say relatively easily fixed, but typically can always be fixed.
Can you give us a definition of PTSD and how you believe it's created?
And then contrast it with schizophrenia, if you could.
Well, okay. PTSD is right at the top end of the anxiety scale, if you like. And typically it is triggered where the person is involved in a death or a near-death experience or ongoing violence that the mind connects to extreme danger. And the typical situations are, for instance, war veterans, people that are coming out of the wars, the guys that are coming back, or the guys and gals that are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and, of course, the historical ones of Vietnam and World War II, where it hadn't been completely defined. It's always situations of extremely intense danger. Natural disasters will do it. Accidents will do it. Rape will do it. So there's quite a wide range of situations that can happen. It can be the victim who is actually involved, or in a lot of cases it can also be the carers and the emergency services personnel dealing with death. Typically people like police, ambulance, firefighters. I've done a lot of work with the local authorities and firefighters after some of the massive bushfires that we have here in Australia. And the firefighters are affected just as badly, or if not more, than some of the victims that are involved. All these groups have some horrible, horrible stories to tell. And one group that often gets left out of the equation are the animal carers, of course, in disastrous situations, because the research that I've done shows very, very clearly that PTSD occurs when a particular event overwhelms the major values of the victim all at the same time. So without trying to get into a graphical description, your emotional memory primarily consists of memory groupings that have high emotional value in them, and that's what creates a value system. But the ones that get assaulted when PTSD triggers are things like the values around self, life and death, caring for others, relationships, and all of these major values take a hammering in the same instant in time. And it just creates this overwhelmed situation, and the mind decides almost to shut down to create some behaviors which will protect them from that. Now, I was just about to talk about some of the symptoms that people identify, and certainly that affect people quite deeply. The major ones that express themselves in really deep PTSD, flashbacks back to the original event. Now, these are extremely disturbing situations because they can happen at any time. Usually there is a trigger that will set it off, but it could be that you're sitting there having dinner and suddenly you're back in the original event, and it scares the heck out of not only you but everyone around you. You can imagine a soldier coming back out of Iraq or Afghanistan, for instance, and suddenly they're back in Afghanistan and they're actually reacting as though they're in the original near-death experience, and they're doing that in a dining room in front of their family. That can be very, very scary.
Yes.
So that's what I was talking about before in the sort of kind of psychotic symptoms that can be expressed. But that doesn't happen all the time. But also nightmares can be pretty bad. Intrusive thoughts, so that you just can't get the original event out of your head, and it keeps coming back all day or regularly during the day, which increases your stress levels during the day as well. Typically, people with PTSD will avoid the behavior of people, places, or events that the mind sees as related to trauma. Now, what I mean by that is, for instance, somebody, again, in a war zone that has been taught never to go into open spaces, will avoid parks and open spaces when they're back in civilian life, that remind them of that. Huge amounts of anger come out of PTSD. And there's a couple of different theories about that, why that happens. But in extreme cases, it causes a lot of violence in families, punching holes in walls. You know, it's uncontrollable anger that simmers to the top, and again can be explosive, can happen at any moment without any real reason for it happening. Guilt is a big one, and guilt can come from two places. Either the person who has PTSD believes that they should have been able to help the person who died, assuming that it's not actually been inflicted on themselves, but they've observed a death of a friend or someone like that. And the guilt comes from either not being able to have helped that person, or that they believe they should have died in their place. And that can be really, really deeply felt over many, many decades. There are a number of other symptoms, but the other thing that goes hand in hand with all of this is depression. Typically, somebody with PTSD has real trouble seeing the future or any perception of the future, and as a result of that, a deep depression can set in. The statistics would show that the suicide rate in people with extreme PTSD is very, very high. It's 3 times the national average. And the effect that these symptoms can have on other people around you are very, very significant.
Of course.
It's very rare that a relationship or a marriage will survive severe PTSD, because the emotional swings that are really not understood by other people in the family typically cause all sorts of problems. Many PTSD victims end up lonely, drinking, using drugs to try and escape from the emotional onslaught. And there was some interesting research in Australia that the military did here on health of soldiers coming back out of war zones, and it showed that even the children in families where one of the adults has PTSD, the children kill themselves at 3 times the national rate.
Why would that be? Do you have any idea?
Sorry? I
said, why would that be? Do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, just the intensity of the environment. You know, it's no different to you having a child coming out of a extremely violent family.
I see.
Have very, very high suicide rates as well. It's the stress levels of living in that environment. And one of the big problems with somebody with PTSD is the inability quite often to show love and affection and to be able to connect to other people.
Right.
They stop enjoying doing things that they used to enjoy, and one of those is enjoying their kids. So the kids, especially when they're really young in that critical first 5 years, if they don't get the love and affection and what they see as violence and anger, coming out of the PTSD, which is uncontrolled, then quite often kids take it on themselves that they're the cause of it. And that's part of the problem. I think you said originally that that you believed in the US, for instance, 70% of people end up being faced with trauma at some time in their life.
Right.
Well, any one of those people can do it.
That's right.
But one of the big problems is that statistically only 10% of victims actually ever seek professional help. Yeah, and they see themselves as weak or defective or going nuts. In reality, it's partly an emotional issue, but to a huge extent is a biochemical issue, because most people with PTSD have already been through at least 5, 10, 15 years of high anxiety levels prior to the trigger. And that's a significant component of PTSD. People ask me why, you can have a set of twins that go to war, and they've been brought up in exactly the same environment. They've had the same education. They've had the same influences in their life, the same learnings, and one can come back with PTSD and one won't. Well, it can come down to something as simple as slightly different dietary preferences. It can come down to the fact that one word or one event happened to one of them that didn't happen to the other, which created a mindset of slightly higher anxiety, and that can build up to a point over 10 or 15 years of creating a high enough baseline anxiety to trigger the PTSD in one and not the other. And it can be as simple as that. So it's not a matter of weakness in somebody, it's a matter of circumstance and how they've lived and what they've eaten to a certain extent as well.
I perceive two words that you use that I really think I need, maybe other people need to know the difference between depressed and anxiety. Depression and anxiety seem to be the words that come off your lips about PTSD. Yeah. What's the difference?
Well, the difference is anxiety typically comes from two sources. Anxiety can be a higher level of adrenal function or adrenaline and other nervous system components like the neurotransmitters that are overfunctioning and producing this internal level of anxiety or edginess.
Right.
It can also come from the fact that some people concentrate on the negative aspects of life or how the world affects them rather than the way they can affect the world, and that can change their perception of future. So anxiety typically comes from a negative understanding of the future, their future. So they worry about the future. That's where anxiety comes from.
Okay.
Depression is a comorbid condition where people don't see a future. They have trouble perceiving a positive future of any sort. But it can also be chronic depression, which again comes out of a biochemical function where the neurotransmitters are depressed in their function, so the emotions are depressed as a result. But they're two different things. Anxiety is almost like an upper where you're extremely intensely involved in whatever you're doing, even if it's a view of the future, whereas the depression is almost like a downer, goes in the opposite direction. So they're the two things.
Okay, thank you.
We hear about the soldiers coming back from war, and obviously war zones have high levels of anxiety disorders. What do you see being done to help them, and do you feel the treatment they're receiving is adequate?
I could get myself into a lot of trouble here. The answer is no, they're not being handled properly. And I think there is two components to that. And from a military perspective, I can perhaps understand the thinking in one way, but in what is happening with the guys that are coming back, I just can't get my head around it. Some of the military view that I witnessed is that you don't want soldiers in the field that are laid back and almost sleepy in what they're doing because they consider that as not beneficial to a war effort. So typically they seem to be on high levels of anxiety a lot of the time. Now, we know that out of any war zone, you're going to have around 2/3 of people coming back will have the symptomology, the official symptomology of PTSD. There'll be pretty well all of them will be affected in some way. Now, out of those 2/3, about 2/3 of those will end up resolving the clinical signs of PTSD themselves within about 90 to 120 days. That is, the anxiety level comes down, the baseline anxiety level comes down to a point where they can handle the issues. Doesn't mean they don't have an anxiety disorder, but it means the clinical signs of PTSD have abated. But it still means then that 20% of people coming out of a war zone are going to have full-blown PTSD, and if it's not treated, they'll have it for life. Now, that's where I get into arguments with the traditional model, because those people can be treated, but the methods that are being used typically are not doing the job, and in some cases make it a lot worse. A lot of the clients I've had come to me and say that they've been going to the traditional model for 20, 30, 40 years in some cases, and gradually getting worse because they're made to relive the original event over and over again. Well, in doing that, it just gives the mind an instruction that the method it's using in causing the flashbacks and the anxiety and the depression is a valid method.
It's correct,
so it
right.
continues to do it. Yeah, so it makes it worse over time.
Yeah, the traditional model that you said is sometimes causing more harm than good. What would you do instead?
Well, the difference is that in some of the traditional models like cognitive behavioral therapy and in some cases EMDR doesn't do quite the damage, but in the top end of the spectrum of PTSD, where you're using cognitive behavioral methods or primal therapies where you keep going back and revisiting the original problem, what you're doing is triggering an awareness of the trauma, and by doing so, giving the unconscious mind an instruction that is okay, continue doing it. So over a period of time, the symptomology can become worse and worse. Now, CBT, for instance, can be okay where there is a rational cause for a problem, or where somebody has the ability to at least intervene on their own behalf. But PTSD is way beyond that. PTSD for most people is uncontrollable. They don't believe they have any control over it whatsoever, and history has proven that. So in going into CBT, for instance, most of the people at the upper end of this spectrum have no control, have no ability to change it, so their mind just takes on the role of giving them more of what they had, and it just gets worse and worse.
Yeah, I can see that. We've had a number of people with PTSD, not military people that have been in car accidents, have had severe life-changing events. And but we haven't used hypnosis, in total agreement with you, haven't used hypnosis to go back to revisit the trauma in any sense at all. But we have found the hypnosis has worked very well to help them to understand that they're in that they're safe and protected, that the event is past, that it's over, and turn off that flight or fight response. Is that similar to what you do when you use hypnosis?
No, it's not. I don't actually use hypnosis in a situation of PTSD or an extreme PTSD.
Okay. So you're using purely counseling?
No, well.
Okay, tell us what you do.
There's two components to it. Because it's a long-term anxiety disorder, even with people that have only just taken on the triggers or the symptomology of PTSD, there's still a long-term high level of anxiety pre-existing that needs to be dealt with. Because if you don't get that baseline anxiety level down to somewhere near a normal level, the PTSD will continue to trigger, even in terms of phobias or panic attacks and those sort of things. So you've got to do that. And 60 to 70% of that problem has become, by the time this triggers, has become a biochemical problem, so that the nervous system's not working properly, the neurotransmitters are not working properly, they're short of dopamine and serotonin, and you need to deal with that first. Because if you're using any kind of hypnotic intervention, you don't know if the responses that you are getting are psychotic, pre-psychotic, or coming from a place that's not related to this particular event. Mm-hmm. So you've got to deal with those, or you don't have no control over the hypnotic process. When you can do that and the anxiety level dissipates a bit, at least the biochemical side of the anxiety dissipates, you then have someone who is able to concentrate again. Because as you know, one of the critical components of hypnosis or hypnotherapy is that your client has to be able to concentrate and focus.
Right.
In the case of PTSD, that's almost impossible to do. Almost impossible. So you really are opening a door that you may not be able to close. Uh-huh. And I've had people in situations where they've actually tried to use hypnosis under those circumstances, and they've woken up other symptoms which they haven't, because of their experience or lack of experience, haven't been able to deal with. So it's not something that you would go at lightly. You need to really understand this at a much deeper level. You need to understand the biochemical long-term effects of it and deal with those at the same time. The methods I use in terms of dealing with flashbacks, for instance, typically even with somebody that's had the intense flashbacks on a daily basis for 40 years, 2 hours after I see them, they no longer can access that problem. And the reason is that I negotiate, as part of a conversation, I negotiate with their unconscious mind some strategies which no longer cause the problem. And in order to do that, the unconscious part of the mind that is involved must understand that it is not protecting the person by creating the flashbacks or the intrusive thinking. Uh-huh. See, there's no part of your unconscious mind that is there to cause harm.
Right.
And you say that to somebody that's been suffering from PTSD for 40 years and they'll laugh at you. But in reality, the mind of the person causing these problems, even with the schizophrenias, is trying to protect them, but has not been given the correct resources to do that with. It's taken behaviors and patterns that it's learnt in the first 5 years and has used those to try and protect its owner. But in reality, when it understands that it's no longer protecting you, it will drop the behavior instantly.
When you said you were negotiating a new strategy, though. So when you get the subconscious to drop that as no longer helpful, what do you substitute it with?
Your mind at an unconscious level has vast resources. You know, you can't go through 20, 30, 40 years of life without having some significant learned resources, maybe some that you're not using, but at least at an unconscious level, it knows the resources. Most of the parts of your mind that are involved in learning are not aware that the other parts are there until they're given instruction to go and get them. Uh-huh. So you can give a part of the mind that's been causing PTSD an instruction to go and get better resources from another part of the mind, and it will. But the critical factor is that when it realizes that what it's been doing has not been protecting the person, then it will drop the behavior. I mean, an example of this, a lot of people think that it takes 20 months or years to make change at an unconscious level. It doesn't. How long did it take you to learn not to put your hand on a hot stove? Mm-hmm. It was instant. And it learns just as quickly when it realizes that it's no longer protecting you. So it will incorporate new behaviors. You don't even need to know all the behaviors that it will use, as long as it drops the extremely damaging critical behavior that has been causing the problem. Now, I obviously, in a short session here, we can't go into all of that because it's quite in real terms, a complex process with a lot of thought and background in behind it. But it's very, very effective. They don't even need to access the original problem. So they don't have to relive the circumstances over and over again. Mm-hmm. And it's a combination of hypnosis, NLP, and a number of other methods that I've developed over the last 30 or 40 years that I use. So I'm sorry I can't be clearer on it because it's different with every client. Everyone is an individual and they need to be treated individually as opposed to in group sessions. But it's, it is, and this has been a major problem in treating PTSD and certainly the schizophrenia over many years. But the critical thing is that you must at the same time deal with the biochemical issues. And the other important thing is from a clinical perspective, when somebody has been suffering from PTSD for 20, 30, 40 years, quite often it's a major part of their life and existence. It has become how they view themselves. Mm-hmm. And if you rip the PTSD out, you need to rebuild another personality for them. Because if they've identified themselves by the PTSD for half or 2/3 or 3/4 of their life, and they suddenly haven't got that there, what does their personality do?
Who are they?
Yeah, exactly. Who are they? How do they react? How are they supposed to behave? So you do need to, whilst you can take the PTSD out quite quickly, you then need to rebuild a new personality and a new function for themselves, a new self-image, if you like. We've got a number of projects on, and as I think you know, we're doing a postgraduate diploma in the psychonutrition, which is the part that's the 50 or 60% of the problem that underlies the actual PTSD and other anxiety disorders, and schizophrenias. And that's now becoming available. But as we then move in, once we're sure that people can actually handle that component, we're more comfortable then in training people in how to deal with the psychological components.
I know that you're in discussions with the U.S. military. I don't know how far that's gone, but it's very intriguing that you might have a way to prevent PTSD before it even happens. Tell us about that.
Well, I can get myself into a lot of trouble here, I think, but I've got to the point I really don't care. There are a lot of guys and gals that have come out of the military over the years from all sorts of different conflicts that continue to have problems. And I believe that with the research that we've done, there is a way of preparing people who are going into war zones or even, say, police and emergency services that end up continually in death or near-death situations. There is a way of preparing them so that they don't end up with PTSD. And part of that is the understanding that everybody that ends up with chronic lifetime PTSD has an elevated level of anxiety prior to going into it for over, several decades in most cases. Mm-hmm. So there are ways of dealing with that and modifying diet, modifying their emotional state prior to going to war, which would bring the baseline anxiety, say on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is incredibly intense overload anxiety. Most of the average population runs at around about 15 to 20 on that scale all the time. And that's a good, healthy area to be in. But most people with long-term PTSD are up on the 50, 60% on that scale, prior to being in the situation where they end up triggering PTSD. So that can be a part of dealing with it, mm-hmm. but also dealing with how their value system reacts to an extreme stressful event can also be modified. So we started conversations with the US military quite some time ago. We didn't get anywhere. And I can see there are military reasons why they might think that that's not a good idea to do that because it lowers anxiety levels and they want soldiers to have a bit of an edge. Well, there's two sides to that story. You can go back to the methods that, for instance, the samurai used in developing their fighting skills, which are quite legendary. They weren't stressed. They were in a state of automatic process where they weren't using anxiety to drive their method of operating and their automated functions, which made them such good warriors. And I think there are ways of doing that without leading to these high stress levels. The reality is if you've got a soldier in the field that is extremely anxious, they're not going to function properly. They're going to be looking after their personal welfare to a degree where it actually gets in the way. So if you can take care of that, you can build or create better soldiers, better health states in soldiers, which will get them through these PTSD situations.
That's an interesting point that the military has that attitude, because we were just watching a program last night about secrets of the Secret Service, and they were showing them training people in combat in situations where they need to protect the president. And the whole key to that was what you just said, that being relaxed, be in a state of total relaxation while they're engaged in that kind of combat.
Yeah, it's a state of being able to react automatically. Mm-hmm. The reality is that when you get your head in the way of a physical reaction, you will screw it up. If I told you to go and get in your car right now, you don't go through the several million processes of starting to pump energy into your muscles and breathing deeper to convert more sugar to get more energy in your muscles, and then you're going to move this muscle to get your foot off the ground.
Right.
And then you're going to move. You don't do that process because you never get it done. Everything is automated in those processes, and it becomes non-stressful and perfectly coordinated.
Uh-huh.
Well, the same thing can be trained into people in all sorts of situations. The whole purpose of, or the background of training in martial arts is to have those automated processes in place where you automatically react in the correct way under certain circumstances. It is not being able to do that creates high stress levels.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much.
Very, very valuable.